Hello, and welcome everyone to another episode of The Power of Stories with Doctors Schuster and Oxley. So this episode is a special episode for us. We have one of our very favorite collaborators, subjects of our books, Felix Henderson, MC for our book launches. We'll introduce him in a second, and he's going to share with us actually a very interesting story. So we'll look forward to that. Power of Stories, the inspiration once again, we like to just remind you that these podcasts are really inspired by the idea that storytelling, we think, is an underutilized and underappreciated powerful force in business, both for our own professional inspiration to dig us out of holes when we find ourselves caught in traps, but also to some extent from a leadership standpoint. Telling stories is so much more inspiring than being told to do something. I was looking once again at quotes. One of the last episodes we did a couple of quotes. And I found Margaret Atwood was saying that you're never going to kill storytelling. It's built into the human plan. We come with it. And I kind of get that. When we are faced with absurdity, with complexity, we use stories to try and decode it and make sense of it. And it sort of made sense to me. And then Steve Jobs. Of course there's a Steve Jobs. I hadn't heard this, but Steve Jobs talked about stories. The storyteller sets the vision, values, and agenda of an entire generation that is to come. And, Steve has become quite, a legend and probably more famous in his death than he was in life. Stories, you read his biography and you get a sense of how much of a visionary he was. I thought that quote also had some resonance. Helmut, any immediate reflection on the quotes for this episode?
No, I just want to say basically leading a business, being CEO, is being a storyteller. And I think we never should forget that. Yeah? The most inspirational CEOs, leaders are great storytellers, and that also applies to politics. So I think that was a very good quote, David. Thank you.
Well, talking about quotes, I thought I'd share one final one. A beacon for anyone feeling lost in the corporate maze, Schuster and Oxley's A Groundhog Career offers a transformative approach to professional life, urging us to break free from the system's confines and rediscover our true selves. Who said that? Question of the day.
You just said it, I guess.
I said it, but
did you make this up?
Felix Henderson. This is what our esteemed guest today, Felix Henderson, said about our last book. And I just thought, well, if we're on the subject of quotes, we should start by introducing Felix by saying how eloquent he was in talking about A Groundhog Career. So thank you for that, Felix. I'll do a quick intro. Felix started his career as a journalist before moving into brand consultancy, where he worked with BMW, Samsung, Microsoft, and Gareth Bale. So that sounds impressive. He spent 4 years running his own business in the technology space, and I think we talked quite a bit in our first book about how he found that a growth experience through its failure to some extent rather than necessarily success. During the pandemic, he worked and co-founded the Look After Group, and now he is part of the AI revolution with his... he can talk more about this later, but his entertainment business called Oh. So Felix, welcome to the podcast. Let me turn over to Helmut. What would you like to add here, Schuster?
Well, thank you, David. As always, you're brilliant. And we just agreed before that I will introduce Felix. Thanks for taking everything I wanted to say, so I'm not going to repeat that. But Felix, it's a privilege to have you on this podcast. And the quote, David, basically, you gave us for the first book. The second book is actually brilliant, so it shows how brilliant you really are. But I think I might then actually switch and just improvise a bit with my intro. So I think it is probably 10 years that I first met Felix. And the reason why I realized that is at the time he basically founded a company called Bubble Student. And when I first talked with Felix about a potential investment, I was very much impressed by his clarity, his ability to articulate the problem statement and the idea of the business very, very clear. And I have to say, I mostly invest in good ideas, but more importantly, I invest in great people and great founders because I think it's all about the people. And I also like founders that make choices to build their own business very early rather than going into the corporate career. The enterprise, I think Felix, the first enterprise didn't probably go the way that you wanted it. It folded after a few years. It was a great business. I think it's also partly very good execution. But I think result is the learning was just tremendous. And as David already mentioned, you then started new businesses, very successful businesses. And in 2022, I think you co-founded a business called Oh, which is an online AI-supported entertainment platform, which I think is going very well. I think you're a very loyal person. I think your current co-founder is somebody you've been worked before, and basically I've met the guy I think once in person. He's brilliant, and over the years Felix has become basically also a great friend and a loyal supporter of our books. I thank you very much for that. He hosted, as David said, the lounge events, and I'm quite that Felix will be written about 10 years from now. And now over to you, and it's story time. So thank you for that, Felix.
Thank you, and for the sound effects.
It deserved some applause. I love the gadgets. So, Felix, over to you.
Thank you guys so much for the very kind introduction. And I'm incredibly happy to be here and partaking in this next venture of Dr. Schuster and Oakley. Supporting you guys with your book journey has been fantastic. And I know there are hopefully many more in the pipeline. So long may that continue. But I'm just really excited to come and talk here about the story that I've chosen and really how it applies to my life day to day. But actually how part of it links back to some of what Helmut suggested about my first venture, which was learning from that failure and using it to achieve greater success in what comes after. So I think there are a few themes in there which I'm really excited to pull out. So shall I dive into it?
Yeah. No, we
yes,
are.
Go for it. Go for it.
The anticipation levels are at an all-time high.
Fantastic. Well, look, I've chosen a story today from one of my favourite books. It's a book called Black Box Thinking by the British journalist Matthew Syed. And this particular story centres around a famous mathematician called Abraham Wald. He was actually born in the early 1900s in Hungary, and he moved to the US from Austria at the start of the Second World War. And it was there that he found himself effectively working out of a fourth-floor apartment a few streets away from the centre of Harlem on a panel of brilliant mathematicians who, during the war, were asked to work on behalf of the military, solving a whole range of different problems and issues. And it was only really until a few years after the war that Wald's involvement and intervention was one of the most astonishing of them all. He was asked to help the military with a critical issue. During the Second World War, bomber aircraft in Europe were taking huge risks when going across to mainland Europe and Germany and dropping bombs. And actually, for certain periods of the conflict, a pilot surviving a tour of duty was little better than a 50-50 chance. So the wartime leaders at the time realized that they needed to reinforce the planes with armor and try and reduce the number that were being shot down during active combat, protecting them from gunfire. But the problem was the armor was so heavy that you couldn't surface the entire area of the plane because then it wouldn't fly, defeating the entire object and losing that maneuverability. And so Wald was brought in with a simple task of analyze this and prioritize the areas of the plane that need the armor most. And to the credit of the Air Force, he had a huge amount of data to work from. They'd taken extreme trouble in examining the returning aircraft, assessing the extent of the damage, and how they might respond to that. The relief to Air Force Command was the pattern seemed clear. Many of the planes were riddled with gunfire over the wings, over the fuselage, but they weren't being hit in the cockpit or tail. And so the longer the reporting continued, the clearer this pattern became. So the command came up with what seemed like a perfect plan. We'd place armor on the areas of the plane that there were holes, because this is where the bullets were impacting, and therefore where they needed that protection. Plain common sense to the people on the ground, to the people analysing the planes that were coming back. But Wald disagreed and looked at this completely differently, because he realised that the military chiefs had neglected to take into account some key data, essentially the data that was missing, because the only analysis that was going on was of the planes that returned, not of the planes that had been shot down in active combat. And so as a result of that, the observable bullet holes that we saw actually suggested that it wasn't the areas around the cockpit, around the wings, that needed reinforcing, because the planes were able to land after those bombing missions with holes in the wings and with the holes in the fuselage, but still remain in flight. Actually, it was the areas that hadn't been hit in the returning planes that needed most fortification, because it was the hitting of those areas that were ultimately bringing the aircraft down. And by changing this pattern, it proved to be an insight that turned out to have profound importance, not just to Bomber Command, but because of the entire war effort. And it's just a story that I love because it just takes conventional wisdom and the analysis of people that do this day in, day out, and says effectively, no, we're analyzing a biased one half of the data. And if we flip it around and say common and use common sense, all of the planes that are coming back are being hit, but they're able to fly with the damage that's been done to them. All of the planes that are not coming back are being hit in the areas that are flooring them. And it's the absence of being able to analyze those planes that is meaning we're currently applying an ineffective solution. And that intervention by Wald completely transformed the survival rate of pilots in the Second World War and completely transformed the number of planes that were able to come back. And it's just such a rich, deep story that I think there's so much we can take from it to apply to kind of daily life.
Yeah, it's a great story. He actually has a fallacy named after him, doesn't he? The Abraham Wald fallacy, which is a logical error fallacy about dealing with all of the relevant data. And this is, I think, also true of the NASA mission and the one that blew up with the O-rings that failed. Why have you chosen this particular story, Felix? What's the resonance for you?
I think there are a few things here. So the first resonance for me is this central theme of learning from failure. And actually, the entire book, Black Box Thinking, is really built around this theme of learning from failure. It applies this notion to several different industries. And I think, as Helmut said, my first venture nearly 10 years ago now ultimately wasn't successful. But I was acutely aware that to try and avoid repeating the same mistakes when I went on to my next one, we needed to do a kind of uncomfortable picking apart of the carcass and find out exactly what we'd done wrong, as well as analyzing what we'd done right. And so, theme number one, learning from failure to help affect a different outcome. Theme number two, challenging surface assumptions. And I think this is such a critical lesson that me in my entrepreneurial journey, but other people within their life can take on board. In this story, we have a team of experts on the ground in Europe, members of the Air Force who are used to repairing planes, used to analyzing this data, being told by a mathematician sitting on the fourth floor of a Harlem apartment that the way they've been doing things forever is wrong. And I think it takes an awful lot of confidence, but lateral thought to be able to take the surface assumptions that you're taught and that you're told and always be asking questions about why they might not always be the right ones. And I think that approach of not taking everything at face value can be incredibly important and useful as you progress in your career. And I think the third one, which we use on a daily basis within my business now, or try to, is this notion of survivorship bias and this notion of hidden data and perspective shift. If we apply it to our own business, we're often speaking to users and asking them what they like about the platform, what they don't like, but the people that we're not speaking to are the ones that aren't there anymore. And ultimately, it's learning the reasons that they have left the platform or they're not using our service that is actually going to give us the crucial insight into what's working. It's a powerful reminder, and I sort of saw this quote when I was thinking about how to kind of articulate this, that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence in of itself. And so I think, the planes that didn't return in my story were invisible to the data set. But, despite that, it was actually the data around them that was the most crucial. So when it comes to customer feedback, strategic decisions, don't ignore the voices not in the room and only take into account those that are, because sometimes you lose the actual rich insight that makes a really valuable difference. So I think those are some of the three themes that resonate massively with me from that story. And I try and use in business, in life, and day to day.
There's one thing you didn't mention, but you mentioned it in your presentation a few times, the notion of common sense. And I believe that you have tons of common sense. I've known you now for quite some time. Can you relate to that? How common sense basically in your own experience helped you survive, helped you to basically flourish, helped you to build successful businesses?
100%. I mean, I don't know who said the quote, but I think it said common sense isn't that common. And one of the and it's probably true. And I think part of that is because if I apply it to my own entrepreneurial journey, everyone tells you that doing your own thing is hard. and really difficult. And before you step into it, you're not quite sure what the difficult part of it is going to be. Is it going to be that the problem you're trying to solve is so incredibly complex, you have to go into this different mindset of approaching things and try and sort of approach stuff in a different way? Is it the relentlessness of it that makes it most difficult? And actually, what I found is that so often we can be guilty of trying to overanalyze and find complex solutions to relatively simple problems. And generally, common sense, when applied to most issues, to the building of products, to the scaling of business, tends to be a unifying factor that you can link from people within an organization to people outside of it. And if you can hit that thread of common sense, the chances are it resonates that much better with the person using your product or interacting with your business. So I think it's something that naturally we assume is too simple to be the answer, but actually so often by defaulting, stepping back and saying, guys, what's the obvious way to do this? What's the common sense solution to this problem? Sometimes the simplest solutions sprout from that, and they tend to be the most effective ones as well.
But I think you point your story is engaging on so many levels. Talks about blind spots ultimately. Mm-hmm. But I'm also intrigued by the paradox that exists in it to some extent, because in business we're taught that you have to believe that you can do something, that you can achieve the impossible, that there is some measure of what it, to borrow another Steve Jobs story about the reality distortion field that you create in order to pioneer something, to create something that perhaps others can't see. In the process, doesn't that require to some extent for you to either ignore the data or to be willing to suspend judgment on the outcomes and say, no, I think that there is something here that other people can't see? So I suppose in a way I'm bringing it back to the story a little bit and saying, I see a duality between, look, you're missing data and you're likely to repeat the same mistake. You haven't thoroughly analyzed what's really going on. You've made mistakes essentially in your calculation. On the flip side, isn't that how you innovate? Don't you, to some very large extent, have to try to experiment and turn left when everyone else is turning right? So how do you sort of reconcile from an entrepreneurial perspective the idea of seeing what everyone else sees but choosing a different direction?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And I think when it comes to innovation, it can often be about choosing the moment when to innovate and then choosing the moment of consolidating that particular innovation. Like in the context of this story, in many ways, the aircraft in the first instance was probably the great innovation that pushed the boundaries of what was possible in modern warfare at that stage of history. And once that was out there, it was then about trying to fine tune and consolidate the innovation to be able to make it most effective. And I think that kind of like when to move forward and when to pause is one of the most important balances that you can make. And so I think it was innovation that probably got the team to a stage where they were able to try and analyze data that could optimize how effective that particular innovation was or the aircraft was. And so I think the presence of both is always needed. And at the end of the day, I do also think that I'm sure there were scenarios within the story where one or two planes hitting the fuselage or in parts of the cockpit did come back. And there are always exceptions that prove the rule, always the great unicorn story that probably run 100 miles an hour, maybe without doing a lot of the conventional things that we're told and taught to do in order to achieve ultimate success, that through sheer bravery and brute force just managed to find a way to win. And I think that will always exist. But I agree. I think at the core, this combination between consolidation and innovation, knowing when is too much of one and when is too little of the other, is a crucial balance that I think you need to make to ultimately succeed in something.
There's another big theme for me in the story. It's about listening to experts or probably on a wider, more generic basis, listening to others. And I think that's very important. We're driven now in the world by experts. Everyone looks STEM people. Everyone basically is hiring engineers. What is your view? What did you learn from when to listen to experts and when not to listen to experts?
It's a good question. And I don't know if it's kind of a cut and dry answer. I think that a little bit comes down to feeling. I think in our organization now, we're blessed to have a huge number of experts at every position. But we're also blessed to being trying and establish a culture where there's a forum that everyone can pitch in their views. And so my approach tends to be, if there's a particular topic or subject matter that it's in a very specific area of expertise, I think we should listen very strongly to the experience and the voice of that particular expert to frame the problem or help frame a solution. But I think we should also be aware that it's unwise for us to make decisions just based off that and not take into account everybody's voices. And I think what happens in an organization like ours is it's not that I have to be the only one that believes that. The expert in question has to believe and live that as well. They have to be able to understand that their view is probably going to be the one that carries the most weight given the amount of their expertise, but they have to prescribe to the organization's view that decision making needs to be done still taking into account the opinions and views of others, even if they might make the ultimate decision maker. So I think that becomes a cultural question of expertise is important. Choosing the right expert that also has the ability to balance their knowledge and their experience with the views of others to make the right view, I think can make the most effective combination of both of those.
I think, let me jump in here because I think this is a huge challenge. The story you shared is so important. It speaks to certain lessons. Those of us who did our MBAs in the US, we all had to sit through this game called the Challenger. Well, it was called Carter Racing, but essentially it was the Challenger mission, the shuttle that went up and blew up. And there was an engineer in the room at NASA who kept saying, I think there's something wrong with the O-rings. But the data that they were looking at was only ever when the launches took place above 60 degrees Fahrenheit. All of the failures took place below 60 degrees Fahrenheit. They didn't look at that data, and they were saying, okay, so for some reason they were dismissing this engineer's warnings. Hey, there's a problem when the Challenger launches below 60 degrees ambient temperature. The seals don't seal, and obviously it launched and blew up. And then there's this postscript. Well, why didn't we know about this? And the reality is they did know about it, but they chose to ignore it because there were other pressures. There were pressures from the public to go ahead with the launch because it had already been delayed. There were pressures from funding institutions who said, look, you've got to hit these milestones. I find it very interesting that when we're in business, we have to try and juggle these competing priorities. And depending on the day of the week, if we've just been chewed out by the investors the night before, that we have to get to a certain deadline, and the next morning there's this engineer droning on about some really boring data, isn't it tempting to ignore it? Or isn't it tempting to push it to the back and go, I'm going to take a risk? And how do you balance that?
Yeah, I think it definitely is tempting. I think it's such a broad question, and there'd be so many examples of situations where we've had to probably do that. I always think it's just trying to be disciplined about where you want to take into account the views of others and where you ultimately just have to take a leadership decision and kind of go with your gut. I think particularly when it comes to like unlikely sources of information, I think if it's an engineer who's giving a comment on an engineering related item, then I think any good manager or good leadership should always take that into account and inform that in their decision making, because generally that person is closer to a problem. I think when it comes to unconventional thinking or unlikely sources, maybe somebody within the organization that has an observation about something not related to their direct role, that's where it becomes a little bit harder to find the right spot. But I think so often, like what you just mentioned, your investors chewed your ear off the night before, you're coming into work the next day, and you're just so laser focused on trying to find a solution to the issue that they've raised or to try and meet the challenge that they've set. Sometimes you have to be aware that all of us can get so caught up in the specifics and the minutiae of what we're doing on a daily basis that we so often forget to see the obvious thing in front of us that slaps us around the face, which goes back to the common sense thing, which Helmut mentioned. It's generally common sense that identifies that particular issue. And often, no matter how good you are, how experienced you are, how long you've been doing this for, none of us are ever immune from being in a situation where we're so deep, we care so much about what it is that we're trying to do that we can't see the wood for the trees. And I think it's in those scenarios where the unconventional thinking, the unexpected voice is often the one who can turn around and say, I just don't really understand why we're not trying this. And you get that moment of like, yeah, like, why didn't I think about that? And so it is a challenge, and it is about always having the ability as a leader to step back, to self-reflect, to try and be disciplined about how it is you receive feedback and how you then apply it to what you do so that it doesn't become kind of decision by committee, because that's not really good for any business necessarily. And picking the moments where experienced voices have the most relevance. Maybe the unexpected wildcard voice from the outside actually might have a point. But yeah, it's
You
an ongoing challenge. There's no set answer to it, I don't think.
you said something which I think is very true. And a very successful investor was when he was very young. He said, everyone is going to give me good advice. Every investor, every VC, everyone knows what I'm supposed to do. And I said, well, how do you deal with that? And he said, well, actually, that's interesting. I listen to everyone because, everyone has a good view. But then I actually do what I think is right, because I'm the founder. And I think you said something very similar, Felix, that yes, it's good to listen, but at the end of the day, you're the guy who's in charge. So you need to decide. Can we come to another point? Yeah, you talked a bit about your takeaway from the book was also about assumptions. Yeah, that we're making far too many assumptions. That many of our activities are based on assumptions. Can you talk a bit about that? How that influences your daily decision making, and when you don't have the time to check the facts all the time, importance of assumptions.
I think the importance of assumptions and also the danger of assumptions, right, is kind of like a two-sided coin. I think particularly being one of the founders in a business where I don't have a huge amount of experience in doing most of the things that we're doing on a daily basis, right? I kind of sit in this weird central position where I don't necessarily, my co-founder and I have that much experience to draw upon on certain things. And so your initial views are always shaped by assumptions and by what conventional wisdom has told you. And I think there's a positive to that, because I think generally assumptions have somewhat been formed upon the basis of what has been done correctly, at least by a majority, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's kind of a blanket case to you. So I think they can help guide you, but I think you should always dig a little bit deeper to try and find out exactly what it is that's most relevant to you. I don't ever, and as I think my co-founder would say the same as well, we try not to ever take an assumption that somebody else has told us and apply it to our own business without at least trying to question what's being looked at, and at least try and draw other opinions and people into the room to help make a decision. Because then I really do think you go back to flying blind. You're taking a broad assumption which might be able to be used to frame an overall problem you're trying to solve. But if you just take the assumption, you don't do the work to actually make the solution specific to the problem you're trying to solve. And like, again, it's that critical element that is missing.
A bridge into Johara's windows? Is that where you're going with the known knowns and the unknown knowns? It's a lovely little model. I think let's sort of conclude and bring it back to see if we can land on a strong conclusion here. So I think, would you agree we're at our most vulnerable when we are at our most successful, or where we are charging ahead, believing that we've somehow conquered the world? Is there something about our own hubris that makes us particularly vulnerable?
Definitely. I think part of the issue with this, and this comes back to always questioning what you're seeing, is like success is all relative, and success within your own business and plan is all relative to your assumption, right? Not to what's actually possible if you don't take the time to question it. So we have a lot of discussions about, we made a good decision. This product innovation on an A/B test increased the rate of click-through by 10%, which means ultimately it's been successful, which means ultimately we should change the page. Now, that doesn't mean that all the assumptions you put into the formation of this feature and this page were completely correct, because it got a majority, but only by a kind of certain amount. And so I think if you just take any positive sign of success as I'm on the right path, I'm doing things right, actually you miss out on the true limit of what can actually be achieved. Because what might feel like success to you, 10% month-on-month growth, for example, by learning from the mistakes and what is only limiting it to 10%, then you can unlock the 50%, 60%, 70%, 80%. So I think there is a danger in that. I don't think there's ever a danger in using the success to build confidence, because just like failure does, success leaves clues as well, right? Like, we have to analyze what we did right in a scenario as much as what we did wrong. And so we should always build confidence in our own assumptions and our direction if the decisions we're making are ultimately proving to be, in the right direction. but never stop questioning whether you're maximizing that good decision making, maximizing the potential of moving as fast and as hard as you can. And I think sometimes success helps us slip into a comfort zone, which I think, to your point, sometimes makes us super vulnerable to this hubris that actually limits how far we can go.
Felix, I think
good.
as we're coming to an end, I would like to have one final question, then summarizing things. You as a leader, can you define your leadership style in 3 words? What are the top 3 things for you as a leader?
Open. And I don't know if you want me to build on the 3 words, but open because I think always open to other people's perspectives, always open to the possibility of being wrong, always open to the possibility that we need to do things in a different way. And I think you have to remain open right up, maybe to the decision-making process. As we said, there's got to be one decision maker, but you should always be open to learnings and open to your team. You have to move fast in a startup environment. And I don't think thoughtful has to mean going slow if you can put the right framework around it, but thoughtful in everything that you do and trying not to act out of pure impulse when you start to make decisions, because I think that sometimes can become where some of the challenges lie. Open, thoughtful, and I think fearless. And that might sound like quite a grandiose way to describe oneself, but there are a few things I'm trying to get to with that. Fearless in the sense that I think a lot of people realize how hard it can be to take risk after risk, to go again on your own thing, maybe after the first couple haven't worked and people are telling you to go and get a real job doing something else. And actually, you really believe in yourself and the ability of what you're doing, but also fearless in what we as an organization can genuinely achieve, that it's going to be really, really difficult for us to get there. But unless we go through that pain, lean headfirst into the scary stuff, we're never going to achieve what we really believe that we are capable of. And so I think you have to lead with fearlessness when it comes to your vision and how you dictate the path to ultimate success to the rest of people around you. So I might come back in a few minutes and change my mind when I think about it later, but for now, those are my 3.
Let me do see, I'm going to steal Herr Schuster's favorite question at the end of this. So given this discussion and given your story, what's the one, and he says this twice typically, what's the one career lesson that you would leave with the vast audience of podcast followers?
It's one that a lot of people give, but failure isn't final, and you shouldn't be afraid to dig into it. Because I think people get their fingers burnt and they decide, oh, this isn't for me. When actually what's happened despite that failure is for the first time they've built a foundation of what could be ultimate success and built a foundation of insight that they could use to do better next time. And it kind of, even if it didn't ultimately work, it's like you ruined all of that effort and that progress by not using that to try and inform what you do next. So it isn't final. You can always go again. And don't be afraid to dig into the stuff that's uncomfortable, because it's not nice to pick apart what you mucked up and what you could have done better. But only by doing that can you avoid making the same mistake twice. And it's one of the most necessary parts of the ultimate journey to success, is accepting that pain and that you're going to have to be vulnerable and uncomfortable, and really open up and accept that you're not perfect and you did muck things up. But if you're going to not do it again, you've got to learn from that.
Excellent. What I really like is lean into the scary stuff. I so agree with that. Lean into the scary stuff. Really, really good quote. I think, David, it's time to wrap up.
Yes, it is. Felix Henderson, thank you very much. There's one final quote that I was going to share as we ended here. Some very wise person once told me when we were trying to prepare for our first book, one of the critical things you have to do in professional life is give someone permission to call you out. You must have someone in your life who you are 100% honest with. No gloss, no exaggeration, no spin, and no outside vested interests. I think we have used that quote a few times. It is Felix Henderson who gave it to us. And so I want to say thank you for that, because it does really reinforce this idea that professional life sometimes can feel very lonely. It can feel like you're fighting a rearguard battle against the world. And we are, to some very large extent, only as good as our support mechanism, but we underplay that support mechanism. We for some reason put it to one side and sometimes let it languish. And one of the things you did when you gave us that quote was just reinforce. The battle doesn't have to be lonely. We choose to make it lonely. That's our choice. And in a way, you coming and doing the podcast with us reinforces that we are a bit of a tribe here trying to help people have a better professional experience. So I want to thank you again for that. I think this has been a wonderful podcast. I love the story. It's one of my favorite stories. So thank you for bringing it to us. Helmut, any closing thoughts from you?
No, just really much luck for your new business. I think you're going to be very successful, and it's always a pleasure talking with you. Thank you.
Thank you,
Felix,
guys.
how can people, this business of yours that people are intrigued by, should they look it up? Should they look you up? Would you invite people to join? How can they go about finding out about your new venture?
We'd invite everyone to come and check us out. It's ochat.com. And there you can find some of the amazing things that we're doing and also how we're using AI to really push the boundaries of entertainment. And I think people will be really excited and interested to see what we've got on there. So ochat.com, please do head over.
My only advice to people is don't miss out on that. It's a great product.
Okay, so we're going to wrap this podcast. Thank you to Felix once again. Thank you to Helmut. If you've enjoyed this podcast, there are other podcasts. Check out, I'm going to do the check out because I'll put the graphics in a second. Check out the links here and here. We are also very active with our monthly newsletter. We very much enjoy putting that out. Our latest newsletter is about to go out. Our Instagram account is amazing. We have this Instagram manager now who is doing an extraordinary job. We give her credit for everything that's going out rather than us. The website, and of course, if you've enjoyed this podcast, but even if you haven't enjoyed this podcast, read the books. I think you're going to enjoy them regardless. So please check out the 3 books that are currently out there from Doctors Schuster and Oxley. So with that, it's goodbye from me and
goodbye from me.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.